Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Furiosa Curia Show. I appreciate you being here. I just finished interviewing Vaneetha Rendall Risner, and she wrote the book Walking Through Fire, a memoir of loss and redemption. And so this, I guess to summarize the book, 21 surgeries by the age of 13, years in the hospital, verbal and physical bullying from schoolmates, multiple miscarriages as a young wife, the death of a child, debilitating progressive disease, riveting pain from polio, abandonment, unwanted divorce, just a lot of suffering. And so she talks in the book through all those details, how she experienced them and how God helped her through. And it's an incredible book. The podcast you're about to listen to talks about a few of the details, but nothing in comparison to the book. So I would highly recommend the book, and I hope you enjoyed the podcast as well. Okay, Vaneetha, thank you very much for doing this. I'm pretty excited about it, actually. I don't know if you remember this, but I actually met you at in the Phoenix Desire and God conference in 2019.
Oh, wow.
Yes, you and your husband, me and my wife were there.
Okay. You look familiar, but I don't remember our conversation specifically. But when I saw you on camera, I thought, I feel like I've met him, but I didn't really know. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. It's interesting, guys. So I was reading your book the last week, and so 2 months after that happened, we had a stillborn baby. And so reading your story this week in your book, which was, I think everyone should read. There was a lot of I guess I felt a connection, and I thought the book was extremely well written, and so I'm super excited to talk to you about it today.
Oh, wow. I'm so sorry about that loss, though. I'm sure that felt real, just having your house all ready to bring home a baby.
Yeah, I did. Yeah. I mean, it's I guess it's hard to explain to people. I mean, it's not, I don't think it's like losing a 2-month-old like you did with Paul, but, or an older child, but it's still, it's the memories that I guess that you don't have. But yeah, as I was reading your book,
never was, which is often just as painful, in lots of ways. So.
Yeah. But I guess, so I'm encouraging everyone to read your book. All the details are in there, but maybe we can start with, maybe you can give your life story and we'll go from there, and I'll ask some questions after that. Okay.
I would love to give my life story. So you mean like the entire thing, like go through?
Yeah. I mean, okay. Yeah, take 10 minutes and so, and then basically how, where you grew up and how you're born, where you're born, all that stuff. But then of course, all the suffering that you experienced.
Okay. So I was born in India, and when I was 3 months old, I contracted polio. Now the doctors had no idea what it was. In India, they don't give the vaccine till you're 6 months old. So my parents took me to a friend who was the doctor, and she thought I had typhoid because typhoid was going around. So she gave me cortisone to lower my body's fever. I was 105-degree fever, but it lowered my immune system. And within a few days, I was completely paralyzed. And then they took me to the pediatrician, and the doctor said, wow, there's nothing we can do. She has polio. She's going to be paralyzed. And I was at that point a quadriplegic. And they told my parents to leave India because there was no medical services at the time. And in India, when you have any kind of disability, it's much more like a curse on your family. And so that, combined with the fact that there's not a lot of services, my parents left as quickly as they could. So my dad, who was a professor in India, left and took a manual job installing telephones in London, manual laborer's job. And so moved to London, which is where I had my first surgery. And I was 2 when I had that. And then we moved to Canada, which is where I started having surgery. So my dad took a job in Canada, and I had 21 operations by the time I was 13. So I lived in the hospital in Montreal for the most part. I lived in the Shriners Hospital. I lived on a ward with about a dozen other girls and was in my bed. I was flat on my back in a body cast for 9 months straight. Only saw my parents on weekends. And so my life growing up was just sort of this half-life of being at home, seeing my parents, being close to them, but also being bullied when I was in school. Lots of kids made fun of me. when I was 7 and I had just learned to walk. A group of kids threw stones at me and called me a cripple. So I really didn't know what to make of life when I was home. It was almost harder to be home than to be in the hospital. But lived in the hospital on and off for years. And then when I was probably in middle school, stopped having surgeries. But life at that point became very difficult for someone with a disability. Just felt like I did not fit in and grew very angry at God. My parents were believers, went to church, but I really wanted nothing to do with God.
And the disability, in your later teenage years, that was the walking disability that you had trouble walking?
Yes. So that's a great question. So I walked with a limp, so had a hard time walking far distances, but I could walk. And actually, because of all my surgeries, was actually lived a pretty normal life. Like I could do most of the things that other people could do, but my arms were always really weak, but people could not see that. So I didn't have surgeries on my arms. So they were very, very weak, but that's not something other people can observe. So and I exercised a lot. My arms got stronger. So pretty much looked like everybody else. But my limp is what people noticed and asked me, what's wrong with you?
Okay. Yeah.
So that made me feel very different. And I couldn't play sports or anything. So it wasn't like a normal life in that sense. So when I was in high school, I got involved in FCA, which is Fellowship of Christian Athletes. And I didn't go because I was an athlete or a Christian, but all the cute guys in my high school went to FCA. So I went too. And a friend and I would sit in the back and talk about boys. But then she went away on a retreat, came back, told me about the Lord and kept talking about it. And so finally, I just asked the Lord. I went home and said, God, if you're real, show me. And really didn't believe that God was going to answer me in any way, because I didn't even believe that God existed.
And you were angry at God at this time as well?
Yes. So I was really mad at God if he existed. And it was sort of went back and forth between he didn't exist, and that was easier to, in some ways, to deal with than if he did exist and let this happen.
And was Christianity a big deal in your home as well growing up? Or was it like what kind of Christians were your parents? Was it a big part of their lives, or was it a smaller part of their lives?
It was a big part of their lives. So my mom taught Bible study, taught me Bible study, and taught adult Bible study most of my childhood. So my mom spoke about the Lord. We did a Bible study every day when I got home from school. So crazy that I would listen, but somehow just didn't mean it.
Didn't want it.
Yeah, didn't want it. Knew all the right answers though. So I could, pretty much if you say church, Jesus, or God, you've got the right answer. So I was good to go.
Yeah.
But not a strong relationship. But my sister was a believer, and my parents. So that was an interesting sort of dynamic. And I did not tell them that I was not a believer. So I went home that night saying, God, if you're real, show me. Then randomly, I say randomly, of course, there's nothing random with God, but opened the Bible to John 9 and read when Jesus is talking to his disciples, and they see a man blind from birth. And Jesus says, the disciples say, who's saying this man or his parents that he was born blind? And Jesus says, it is not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the work of God would be displayed in his life. And so that was the moment for me, Kyle, where God changed everything. And I realized I had always been asking this question, why? Why did this happen? Meaning, what had I done? Which is why I was so interested in this passage in John 9. But Jesus was answering not what had he done, but what was the purpose? And that was such a different answer to the why question. And I think that's the answer that we all as believers, when we ask that, I think God often answers with, what is the purpose? What am I doing in this? So came to Christ, but as knelt down by the side of my bed when I read that and committed my life to Jesus. but didn't tell my family, which was kind of funny. But because I'd been doing Bible study with my mom every day, it felt really weird to say, you know what, I didn't really have a relationship with God, and now I do. But it's kind of funny because years later, my sister and my mom specifically said, wow, she was totally different. Like they knew that something had happened, even though I had not told them. So then I went on to kind of live my best life now, I would say, and went to grad school. Everything in my life sort of seemed to be falling into place. Married a classmate, and then I had a miscarriage. And that was sort of the first thing of like, wow, this life isn't going the way I thought it would go. And to back up a little bit. So after I went to college, I went to University of Virginia. I moved to Boston and lived there for 4 years. I walked to work. I lived a very normal life then and just did everything I wanted to do. I got really involved in our church, loved crafts. That was one of the things I didn't mention. I was an artist. I love everything to do with art. So that is a lot of what I spent my time on was, crafts, painting, doing those kinds of things. So then anyway, so fast forward, had a miscarriage, and then my husband had an affair, which really sort of shattered my whole world of like, I thought if you're faithful and you pray, then your life is going to be good. So that was kind of shocking for me, but we were able to put our marriage back together, which was pretty amazing because of the Lord and forgiveness. But then we had a son who I can talk way more in detail about as we go on through the interview, but through a series of things, he was taken off some medicine that he needed and died. And that really sort of that really, should I start again or something?
No, that's fine. You keep going.
That shattered my faith because I wouldn't say shattered, actually. I was shattered and wondered where God was in the middle of that. So really drifted from God. And then God really met me in these incredible ways. Just when I cried out to him. So after that suffering, I knew that God would never.
And when you say God met you in this suffering, what does that mean? What does that look like when you say that? I mean, losing a 2-month-old, your husband being unfaithful, those are extremely heavy things. And so,
I'm happy to talk about that. So it was interesting because Paul was born with a hypoplastic left heart, which means he had half a heart. And we knew that before he was born. So we got the best surgeon at the time in the world to do his surgery. He was out of the woods. So we thought, oh my gosh, this is perfect. This is great. God is going to be honored through his life. And then when he was 2 months old, his surgery was in Michigan. We took him in to see a pediatrician when our normal pediatric cardiologist was out. So this guy did not know anything about Paul's heart condition. Impulsively took him off all his medicine, saying, oh, he looks great. We don't need to do anything. But he didn't really understand his condition. And so within 3 days, he died. And it probably was one of the darkest times in my life, just wondering, where is God and how did this happen? And so my Bible was unopened for months. I didn't want to draw near to God. But the funny thing is, right after Paul died, my husband and I spoke at Paul's funeral and said, God never makes a mistake. We felt really strong and I felt like God carried me. And then months later, I wanted to pull it all back because I thought, I don't know where God is. But I remember being in the car one day and just wondering, what is the point of all of this? And I was so depressed. And I put in a worship tape just to sort of get my mind off of whatever was happening. And all of a sudden, I sensed that God was in the car with me. And it was this wild sort of sense. So I ended up turning off the tape because I thought, what is happening here? And I was just singing along with the worship song. And I just sensed that God was in the car saying, I'm with you. I'm never going to leave you. Like, don't despair that my relationship with you is going to be different because you've lost Paul. Like, my relationship with you is actually going to be better. And that was kind of this thing that I didn't even understand it, but it was, I would describe it as the most incredible moment of my life. Honestly, it felt like heaven. It felt like, wow, it means that it doesn't matter what is happening in my life, that God, this presence of God will always be there. And that was probably even more real to me than the time that when I committed my life to Christ, when I felt like God was really there. It was just this moment where God carried me.
How long did that last?
Probably just a few minutes of just sensing like, Jesus, you are right here. And I feel like sometimes in suffering, the veil is just a little bit thinner than other times. And there's just this sense that God is there. That is probably the most profoundly I've ever sensed that, but I've sensed God's presence really through reading the word a lot and pretty strongly as well. But that was more like, well, God is in this van, my minivan with me. And I go back to that moment sometimes, just remembering like, this is what heaven feels like. It feels like joy in the midst of the worst, that you don't even think about anything else but God.
Wow. And I'm curious, when you guys lost Paul, and maybe this is more a question for your ex-husband, but did he feel that it was a punishment for what he had done? Do you know?
I don't know if he did. We never really talked about that, whether he felt that way. I didn't feel like it was a punishment, but I felt that it was, God didn't care. That, like, I had this sort of functional theology that if we do the right thing, then God's going to do the right thing for us. And so it felt like, what did I do wrong? Like, why did you not hear me? And we had a lot of people come over when I was pregnant with Paul, just saying, if you pray the right way, if you do the right things, then Paul will be healed. And so for him not only to not be healed, but to actually die because of doctor's mistake just made me feel like, did we not pray the right way? Should we have done something different? So there was just a lot of questions that that sort of swirled around in our minds. But I don't know specifically if Dave felt like, wow, this is punishment because, we had just been kind of recovering from his affair. So I don't know if he thought, oh, wow, this is God's punishment for that.
Yeah. So you have this this moment after Paul's passing where you felt God's presence. Where do we go from there in your story?
Okay, so then I went on, had another little girl, Christy. So I had an older daughter, Katie, after Katie was born, then I had 2 more miscarriages, then I had Paul, and then Christy after Paul died. So it was just raising the girls and, just pretty much moving on with life. When 6 years after Paul died, I was diagnosed with post-polio syndrome. And I had not even heard of that. I didn't know what it was, but I had been doing something, and all of a sudden I felt this huge pain in my arm and didn't know what it was, and ended up going to doctors for months, actually trying to figure out what it was. And finally somebody said, do you think this is related to polio? And I thought, no, I don't think it's related to polio, but went to a polio clinic in Boston. And that's when they diagnosed me with post-polio. And what post-polio syndrome is it happens to about 70% of the people who have polio. And the way they explained it to me is when you get polio, your primary motor neurons die, which is why I was a quadriplegic. But then you get secondary motor neurons, which sprout up, and they sort of take that place. So you're able to do things that you couldn't do when you first got polio. But they said those secondary motor neurons have a limited life. And so they're not like primary ones where you exercise and you can constantly rebuild them. And so they said they come with a certain amount of energy, and when you wear them out, they're gone. And so they basically told me to stop doing everything that I was doing. I love to cook. I love to paint. I love to do all of those things. And they said, you've only got a certain amount of energy. So the more you do, the weaker you're going to get. So I had to give up so much of what I was doing. And I kind of joke around that I was totally fine giving up vacuuming and dusting and all of those things, but it was a lot harder to give up painting, cooking, having friends over, doing stuff with my girls. And I could still do things, but not the same way. And I was pretty addicted to scrapbooking, and I had to give that up. So just a lot of
And you had to give it up because of the pain, or because they said, wait one day, if you don't give it up now, you're going to be paying for it later?
Yes, it was a little bit because of the pain, but more because they said, if you don't do it now, you will be paying for it. And one of the things they said when I said, what happens if I don't make these changes? Like I can't, I can't do all of this at once. And I remember the one that said to me, if you don't do this in 10 years, someone will be feeding you.
Wow.
So, and, my kids were young at the time. I was in my 30s. And so I thought, well, I can't have somebody feeding me in 10 years. So that brought reality, kind of front and center. So that is why I stopped doing all of those things. Now, I didn't stop doing all of them right away, but within a few years I got voice recognition software, which is what I use now. I got an adapted van, which I didn't have before. So I really had to make radical changes in my life as a result of that diagnosis.
Crazy. And then more stuff happens after that.
Right. So I'm sort of adjusting to this, knowing that one day I'm going to be a wheelchair. I mean, basically, I said one day you're going to be a quadriplegic again. And so I'm sort of trying to figure this out. And then Dave, my ex-husband, came home and told me he was leaving for someone else. And that rocked my world, probably more than all the other things, because I was alone now. Like when Paul died, we had each other, but all of a sudden now I have 2 adolescent daughters who don't understand what's happening. I'm raising them, and I have post-polio. So, he moved to another state, and I'm doing everything for them, driving, figuring out life. And so that shattered me, because we were really close. We had put our marriage back together. I did not expect that. Our family was close. So my daughters felt very betrayed. Like, where is God? And, you guys were involved in church. I was leading women's Bible study. At one point, he had been a deacon in our church. So it was just this huge thing. And it shattered all of us to think that, a life that sort of looked pretty good on the outside and that we thought was good really wasn't what we thought it was. So that really, I think, is what made my daughters question what was real and whether God was real, sort of in the way that I had. And that, though, was the time, I would say, when I drew closest to God, because I had no other options. Every day I would get up really early and just pour out my heart to God, because I was homeschooling my 2 daughters, which kind of is crazy. But so I'm alone homeschooling them. They're angry. There's just lots of unkindness to rage sort of pouring out in our home. And I would just get up and say, I would read Psalm 119 over and over, which is a very long psalm. But just reading, my soul clings to the dust, revive me according to your word, is one of the things I would say, because I just needed God to revive me, because I didn't know how I was going to make it. And God did. I mean, that was what was crazy, is God revived me in ways I would never have even expected. And I really loved the Bible before then, or I liked the Bible, I would say. And there was lots of times when I got a lot out of it. And there were other times when it felt like cardboard. But after that, I just learned how to dig into the Bible, love scripture, believe that God was speaking to me. And that was a big change for me. I started believing every day when I opened the Bible that God had something to say to me. And that really changed my perspective. If you open the Bible thinking, God is going to speak to me today, and I just need to find what he is saying, you approach scripture very differently. You read each word, you pay attention, because the living God is about to talk to you. And that method, or just that attitude, has really changed the way I've studied the Bible since, just believing there's something for me versus feeling like, okay, today I just got to get through this. and move on to the rest of my day. And so I'm very grateful for that time because it drew me to God and the presence of God in a different way than after Paul died, when it was really just this sense that, wow, God is in my car. This is heaven. Versus after Dave left, feeling like God is opening up the scripture to me and God is talking to me. And that was more of a replicable experience, because that can happen when we open the Bible and we say, God, open my eyes that I would see wonderful things in your law. And we just ask God, he shows up. And I have had these amazing times with God just by believing that God has something to say.
And wow, it's such a, I guess we're kind of doing a flyover of your life here. And so for the listeners, if you want to get more details on all this, please read the book. It's incredible. And the detail in there, I think, is very key. So your husband leaves you, you have young teenage daughters in your home, but you're close to God. Walk me through what's going on next.
Okay. So life is kind of falling apart, and trying to go back and forth with my ex-husband. Like sometimes he wants to come back, not sure. So we're sort of, our whole family is in limbo, but then he ended up saying, I want a divorce. So we got divorced, and he married the woman that he had left me for. And just sort of started asking God, what do you want me to do? I'd been sort of this wife and mother, and I was a mother and certainly very busy with that. And I'd been homeschooling my kids. I finally ended up putting them in school. But God really impressed upon me through a bunch of friends that maybe I should start writing. And it was so funny because I have a business degree, never thought I would write anything. But 3 friends said to me, I think you should write about your life. And, when the third person says that, you think, okay, maybe I need to do that. So I prayed and I said, Lord, just show me. You might need to skywrite this. Like I have no interest in writing. And then the next day I went to my mailbox and there was this flyer that said, do you want to write your life? I'm not kidding. And I thought, okay, wow, that's close to skywriting, Lord. That was pretty good. So I ended up signing up for a class with a continuing ed at UNC. I live in North Carolina, and wrote a memoir with my professor, actually, but it was just about my childhood. And my professor is an avowed atheist, which was kind of funny, but he really liked my story about my childhood. So wrote that. Nobody was super interested in publishing it, though. And so my professor said, you know what? People write blogs nowadays, so maybe you need to start a blog. And I was like, okay, I'll start a blog. But then I didn't know what to blog about because I wasn't a writer to begin with. This was a memoir about my childhood, but I ended up just thinking, okay, all I know is about how God has met me in suffering. So I started a blog. And then interestingly, I wrote an email to Desiring God. I did not know anybody there. I had never met anybody there, and just wrote an email saying, hey, I would love to write something for you guys on suffering because John Piper's theology has shaped me and I'd love to do that. So I think weeks later, I got an email back that said, we don't take unsolicited manuscripts. So, so sorry, but if you feel you have to write on this subject, you can send us something, but it needs to be about 1,000 words, but somebody may never read it. So, there's not a lot of encouragement with that, but I went with that and prayed about it and ended up writing an article, sending it in over the weekend. And that Monday, somebody emailed me and said, we'd like to talk to your pastor, which is wild. So talked to my pastor, and that was up on their blog that week. Oh, wow. So, when God, I knew nobody, and that God used that. And so it was this article.
And just for our listeners, this is a big deal because I think Desiring God gets 2-3 million hits a month, like on their website. That this is a big publishing or a big powerhouse, I guess you could say, in the Christian world.
Yeah. It was so weird that they took that it was up there. It was an article called When God Does the Miracle You Didn't Ask For. And I just kind of outlined my life. And in the article, I talked about the difference between sustaining grace and delivering grace, and how We all want the miracle. We want the parting of the Red Sea. And that is what we beg God for. And sometimes God does that. He saves our children. He does these miraculous things. But no one wants manna, which is the everyday grace of God. It is sustaining us. And yet manna is what draws us to God. Like you see the children of Israel, God parted the Red Sea. And the next thing they do is they're complaining. Like, why did you take us out of Egypt? But manna keeps us dependent on God because that is the food of God. And so I just wrote about that. And there's a lot of response for that. So Desiring God emailed me again and said, hey, would you consider writing for us? So started doing that, which was pretty amazing. They published my first book, which is called The Scars That Have Shaped Me, How God Meets Us in Suffering. And that is a collection of blog posts I'd written because they just said, would you be willing to do that? So did that, which was pretty amazing. And at the same time, so I'm writing for Desiring God. I hadn't published the book yet. And then I wasn't sure what I was doing with the rest of my life, would have really wanted to meet somebody else. And my daughter takes me out to coffee and says, you need to get out there. I'm like, yeah. What do you mean get out there? And she said, well, you want to meet somebody, don't you? And I thought, no, I don't. I don't know how to do that. So she told me to get online, which I really was terrified of. I thought I was going to meet some psycho. And I think I did meet some psychos, but
yeah, you did talk about that in the book, which is pretty entertaining.
Some choice people that I met, but at the same time, just kept praying about it. And actually I was online for a couple of years and then decided like, this is not working out. So I went on to eHarmony to deactivate when basically I met Joel online. I can tell you the longer version of the story if you want to hear it later. But so met Joel online and we started communicating, and I just really loved his heart. One of the first questions I asked him was, who are your favorite authors and pastors? And he said, Kevin DeYoung, Paul Tripp, and John Piper. And because I was writing for Desiring God and I love Paul Tripp, I thought, okay, wow, we are on the same theological page, which in my book, I described that there was a lot of people that said they were believers, but we were on a very different theological page.
Because Paul's bio even said something specifically that was a lot different than everyone else. What was that?
Joel's bio. Yes. So
Joel's bio,
the first question on eHarmony is, what are you passionate about? And a lot of people would say, God, football, and family, not necessarily in that order or something like that. And Joel said, I'm passionate about Jesus Christ because there's nothing else to be passionate about. So at that point, I realized like, wow, we are way more on the same page. And then when I asked that authors and pastors question, I actually screamed out in my house with a friend who was over, I'm going to marry this guy. So we met probably a few weeks after that, and then got engaged. And so we met in July, got engaged in November, and married in February. So,
wow. And he's a nuclear scientist. Is that correct?
Yes, he is.
Just a little side note.
Yeah. So he's a rocket scientist. So yeah. So he's amazing. So we've been married now 6.5 years. It'll be 7 years in February, which is pretty amazing. And I love the fact that his name is Joel, because Joel 2:25 says, I will restore the years the locust has eaten. And through Joel, God has restored so many things. Joel's just an amazing guy. So
yeah. Awesome. Thank you for sharing all that. So I guess I have some questions now. So my first question is, I seen you on the live Ask Pastor John last week. I was on that as well. And Pastor John was talking about the fact that he wants to keep people from being a Demas and walking away from the faith. Yeah. And so when you go through as much suffering as you did, a lot of people would expect you to walk away from God and be angry at God. Did you have times where you considered that? What was saying, you know what, I can't do Christianity. I'm out. This isn't what I want.
Yeah. Well, after Paul died, I feel like is probably the time that I most thought, does God even care? But it's interesting because once you really know Jesus, there's nowhere else to go. You look at, Peter, Jesus says to Peter, are you going to leave? And he says, where can we go? You have the words of life. And so realizing like, I wasn't opening my Bible after Paul died. I felt very distant, but yet I knew that there was going to be no peace for me until I really drew near to God again. So for me, there wasn't I want to walk away, because I knew there was nothing better in the world.
Wow. I think it's for many people, especially that aren't of the Christian faith, it's so hard to understand that because it's so against the grain. And I think that reminds me of that quote that you talk about in the book from Frederick Buechner. I'll read it here for the listeners. The love for equals is a human thing. Of friend for friend, brother for brother, it is to love what is lovely, and lovely the world smiles. The love for the less fortunate is a beautiful thing. The love for those who suffer, for those who are poor, the sick, the failures, the unlovely. This is compassion, and it touches the heart of the world. The love for the more fortunate is a rare thing. To love those who succeed or who fail, to rejoice without envy with those who rejoice. The love of a poor for the rich, of the black man for the white man. The world is always bewildered by its saints. And then there is a love for the enemy, love for the one who does not love you, but mocks, threatens, and inflicts pain. The tortured love for the torturer. This is God's love. It conquers the world. And so you talk about this in the book, how you had a lot of bitterness, and that this quote really broke that, I guess, for you. Talk to me about that.
Yeah. So it was interesting because this was after my ex-husband left. But he was my husband at the time. And I was just very, very angry at him, but also I poured a lot of my anger out onto the woman that he left me for. So spent a lot of time thinking about how I would like to see her suffer. And then was reading this book by Francis Chan, Crazy Love, which is where he quotes Frederick Buechner. And I remember reading it just thinking, oh my gosh, I don't know if you've ever read something where you feel like God is speaking to you, but you don't want to read it. You don't want to hear it. So I read it and I thought, no, God, don't ask me to do anything about this. Cause that last line, which is, the tortured's love for the torturer, this is God's love. It changes the world. And that line just made me think, oh my word, she's not a believer. Like, is God calling me to do something here? And in response to that, I remember just lying in bed thinking, I'm not going to do anything, God. You cannot make me do anything nice for her. But we're no match for the living God. And so I could say that, but then I just felt like there was like an elephant on my chest. And finally I just got up. It was like 2 a.m. and I went to the computer and I thought, okay, I'm gonna, so I was like speaking, because I use voice recognition software, into the computer, just the gospel, which is not what I wanted to say to her. And just basically shared the gospel and said, I've wanted to hate you, but I can't, because I know Jesus and I want you to know him too. And it was funny because I sent the letter off and my first response thinking was, oh my gosh, she's going to think I'm amazing. She's going to think I'm a saint, because I thought I was. But then I didn't hear back from her. And Dave said, yeah, she got the letter, but she was wondering, did you want anything from her? And I thought, oh my word, that's her response to this like heartfelt letter I sent. But the wild thing was, it made me start praying for her, because I started praying that she would come to Christ. And it really changed me from fantasizing about her being in a car accident to thinking, okay, God, I want to see her know you. And so it was kind of funny. I know there's the song that says, pray for your enemies, or pray for somebody. And it's like, yeah, I pray, I pray that she gets hit by a car. I don't know if you know that song, but it was kind of funny. So that's really how I used to pray. And then I started praying that God would really be real to her. And that changed me in ways that I wouldn't have guessed. Like, I would not call myself a super kind or nice person, honestly, but I'm the kind of person that really like rolls over like, oh, I can't believe they did that to me. And yet God really freed me from that. And it was just his grace. And so I didn't feel bitter. So when it ended up that he left and we got divorced, I was not bitter, which is really a work of God. And, it was a tough sort of situation. I didn't mention it necessarily in the book that much, but he had a child with her while we were married. So that was sort of complicating the situation of would we get back together? And then she was pregnant again when we decided to get divorced. So there was,
And when
all
you
of
say
these
like
things.
complicated the fact that you might get back together, like that, I can just imagine a listener thinking, why in the sound would she even consider that?
Yeah.
And you talk about that in the book a little bit. So unpack that.
Yeah. So Dave, after they had their child, Dave came to me, or actually when she was pregnant, and said, I actually really do want to get back together. Like I never intended this to be like we get divorced and I leave you. I kind of intended it to be like not. Um,
And why did you intend that? Because you loved him, or because you believed in the power of God, or
no,
what
no, no.
was you?
So that's what he said,
Oh,
that
okay.
he didn't intend for us to get divorced.
Okay.
Um, I definitely loved him and really believed that God could repair anything. And so I was sort of holding it with an open hand, like, okay, Lord, I will do whatever you want me to do. I don't know if I necessarily want to get back together, but I want what you want. And there is this sense that we sometimes want to hold on to sort of the fairy tale ending, like of okay, so maybe they have this child, she comes to Christ, she marries somebody else, we get back together, our families are friends, and we just see the power of the gospel. Like that is the story I wanted to tell. I did not want to tell the story of I got divorced. Like that just felt like failure to me. So that was part of my own stuff of in the Christian community, saying you're divorced seems pretty shameful sometimes, even though it should not be. But we feel that way. Like somehow, what did you do? Did you not try hard enough? Why don't you believe in the sanctity of marriage? And so that was probably part of it for me. And I think for him, we had a good marriage. And so I think it was hard for him to kind of realize like, wow, I'm throwing this away. And I do know, I mean, he's married to this other person, and I know that he loved her too. So I don't want it to sound like, oh, he always wanted me, but I think it was just a really hard thing because he is a believer, and I think thinking like, what is the right thing as well? Like married to Vaneetha, have two daughters with her. Now I have a son with somebody else. Like, what is God wanting me to do? So I think it didn't feel very clear to him at that point, and it
And
didn't
this,
feel clear to me.
yeah, okay, yeah. And this letter that you wrote, did you ever, all these years later, get any feedback on it?
No, but I've seen her. I've seen Tiffany, and we have gotten to know each other. And she's very kind and nice. We've never talked about the letter, but yeah. So this was pretty incredible. So my older daughter just got married 2 months ago. So I saw Tiffany at the wedding, and we sat at. I chose the seating, and I decided to sit at the same table with her and Dave.
Oh,
And my Dave's parents, my in-laws or ex-in-laws, but really feel like in-laws. And I just wanted everybody at the wedding to see that the gospel is bigger. Like I don't need to be angry because Jesus died for our sins, and Jesus died for all of our sins. And because of the gospel, there's reconciliation. And so I really wanted her and Dave, and Dave and I have really reconciled in terms of friendship, and he came up to me actually and said, I want you to know that your forgiveness of me has changed me. And then she came up to me separately and just thanked me so much for the way I have treated her. And that was pretty incredible to me, for God to very kind for God to give me that, because I didn't need to have that, but it just made me think it's worth it. It's worth it not to be bitter and not to be angry, because one, I was free, but two, it really does make a difference.
yeah. Wow. So in the church today, there's a lot of bitterness. There's bitterness because of the current political scene. There's bitterness because of how churches are handling COVID. There's bitterness because of the vaccine. There's bitterness everywhere. So if you could give a message to the church, what would it be regarding this? Having been freed from it, I guess, yourself.
Yeah. If I could say to the church anything, I'd say Jesus calls us to love. The commandment is, love one another as I have loved you. And are we doing that? Are we dying to self, or are we trying to hold on to our rights? And I say that as somebody who still tries to hold on to my rights. So I'm not saying that in judgment of other people. But the freedom we have when we lay them down is unbelievable. And we're holding on so tightly, we don't know what freedom feels like. But when we choose to not get angry over little things and we choose to put other people first and to forgive, the freedom that happens in our life, I think, is unbelievable. I mean, I feel like forgiving Tiffany was probably the most life-changing thing I did in terms of God's love and God's power flowed through me. And there's this analogy that I have that, so the branches are grafted into the vine at the place of wounding. And so it is often in our wounds that we are most tightly grafted into Christ in terms of just the power of God. And I feel like in forgiveness, forgiveness always involves a wound, or we wouldn't need to forgive. I mean, somebody has hurt us in some way. And I think letting us attach to Christ rather than holding on to it ourselves, but firmly attaching to Jesus and letting his power flow through us is really this feeling and this strength and power that we can't get any other way. So I feel like forgiveness is like this secret that Christians who've forgiven understand, that you never want to go back to holding on to bitterness because of what it does for you.
Yeah. Wow. I know a lot of Christians that struggle in their marriage. They want to leave, even without infidelity that you experienced with your ex-husband. And a lot of them don't know where to go. You've experienced a lot of suffering in your marriage. What would you say to this? What did you need, or what did you receive during the times where it was really, really tough? And how can we help each other, I guess, in the marriages that are currently happening, that are struggling and that we're aware of? How do we help those people?
Yeah. I would say the biggest way we can help people is, one, to pray for them, because we don't know what's going on in their marriages. But also, I think the power of forgiveness, as we just talked about, is the biggest thing in marriages as well. I think it's so easy, I think, for all of us to think about what we've done right and the other person has done wrong. And I think kind of reversing that and really looking at, what have we said? How have we tried to serve other people, our spouse, and really kind of trying to look at their sins against us in light of the gospel and who Christ is, and being willing to overlook and forgive and really look at our own hearts, because all of us are selfish. That's just the way we are. And often when I'm annoyed at my husband, Joel, I realize, like, wow, this is because I'm not getting something that I want, but how much am I serving him? And almost always I start to see, when I really ask the Lord, I see so much more of what I need to change rather than what he needs to change. And I think that's the big thing in marriage, is realizing, like, maybe I need to focus on what I need to do differently rather than what my spouse does. But at the same time, there are legitimate reasons why people, even without infidelity, a lot of people deal with like verbal abuse. I mean, I have a friend who had dealt with unbelievable abuse from her spouse. So I think, just kind of hearing people rather than sort of prescriptively telling them what they need to do is really healing for people, because a lot of times people just want to be heard. And then as we hear them, encouraging them to really put the other person first.
Yeah, that's good. One of the things I was really surprised at when I read your book was how the details, you go into incredible details, not just of the suffering you experienced, but also some of the things that you felt you were doing wrong, about the blow-ups you had with your kids and all those things, which I think makes the story so much more powerful. How hard was that to just be wide open, be like, this is who I am? And there was just hard. Like, you held nothing back.
Yeah, I didn't. And it's so funny because my pastor said to me, I asked him to read it because he was in a lot of those scenes with my ex-husband, and I wanted to make sure I was really accurate. And he said to me after he read it, he said, "Are you sure you want to put this out there?" He said, "This is pretty vulnerable." And I said, "I know." I mean, it was actually pretty crazy. After I turned it in, I thought, do I really want all those people to know this about me? But at the same time, I feel like there is so much power in people being vulnerable, because a lot of stuff happens in our homes and we say things we want to pull back. And I feel like I have grown the most when people are willing to be real and tell me and show me what they have done, versus kind of gloss it over with, hey, I said some things I shouldn't have said to my kids. Well, we go lots of different places with that. And I wanted people to know you can say some pretty bad things and God can really redeem that. And so that's what, and they can say some really hard things to you. So I felt like when we speak in generalities, I don't feel like that helps people that much, because we all fill in the blanks with our own things. And then we all think nobody else is as bad as we are.
Yeah.
And that's not true. And so we feel separated. And I wanted to say, this is how it is, because I think that offers people more hope.
And so would you encourage people that right now are saying the generalities to just be wide open? Of course, you're encouraged to do that. It may be like a small group or a close friend where you can be wide open. But I mean, like being publicly wide open. Like, is there? Would you encourage people to do that, or would you just encourage people to do that? Just make sure, find a few people that you're close with, and just like hide nothing.
Yeah, I would say the latter. Find a few people that you're close with and hide nothing. I mean, I wrote it in a book because I wanted to help people. But it's not like I would get up at the school PTA and say, guess what I just did to my kids?
Yeah.
Like you need to have a point to it. So if you're sharing with somebody who's really struggling with parenting and they're not in your small group, but you realize like I've made a lot of mistakes, then definitely share it. But you don't need to overshare everything that's ever happened in your life, because, there's people involved. I had to get permission from my kids because I was sharing their stuff too. And we have to be really careful about that. So I think if you're sharing somebody else's stuff, you need to be pretty careful, and get their permission. But the reason I did it is because I thought it would be helpful. And so I think looking at your motivation and who you're talking to and why makes a difference.
I definitely agree, though, that generalities don't help. I just think of like my own small group. It's really easy to go in after 2 weeks and be like, yeah, I had a tough 2 weeks. Please pray for me, versus actually telling them. But also, I think like, I've heard my people I really respect in my life say they've struggled with sin, for example, as believers. And I said, oh, okay, so that means when you're a believer, you struggle with sin. But I never knew about the specifics. And if they would have said like, I really struggle with the love of money. I just want as much money as I can, and that's my big sin. Then you'd be like, oh, wow, like you can be a Christian and still really struggle with this. And I think getting specific, I think that really shows, I guess, the realness of it. So I love that part about the book.
Totally agree with that. I think being specific that way about what we're struggling with, I think just brings healing. And I think people find hope in the gospel then, because we always feel like, oh, I'm struggling with this. Is anybody else? Am I different? And I think when believers are willing to say, wow, this is hard, I think vulnerability always draws people, I think, to us and to the Lord. Yeah.
As the divorce happened and your kids are in their teenage years and growing up in the church, were they bullied or any of that because of their parents had separated or things like that?
Yeah. So that was a hard thing in our church. I love our church, but they both said, like, people were kind of whispering, like, I wonder what happened. And, that they just felt different. We were before, honestly, like the perfect Christian family. Like my husband was really involved in the church, or my ex-husband, and I was teaching women's Bible study. So we looked great. I was homeschooling the two girls. And so I think just what other people thought, and people were whispering about them, not necessarily trying to be cruel, but at the same time, just wondering what happened. And I think even sleepovers and all of those things, like we were all of a sudden that divorced family, And so I think there was quite a bit of just feeling a little alienated. Their good friends didn't do that, but then the people that were just sort of one circle back did more. Yeah.
In the book, you talk about cling to God, not the outcome, which I think is, we often like to cling to the outcome. We want, I guess you talked earlier about that. You hoped that everything would be repaired because that's the beautiful gospel story. Why is it important to not cling to what you want the outcome to be, but to cling to God?
Well, it's important to cling to God because we don't know what the outcome is going to be. And if we hang our lives on the outcome, then we're going to be disappointed because we're not God and we don't know what he's wanting. I mean, my good outcome would have been a son who was saved and a body that works well and a marriage that was put back together. And yet I didn't get those outcomes. And yet I got more of God through all of those things. And honestly, I wouldn't trade my life for anybody's. I don't want to walk through those things again, but
Yeah.
to know the Lord the way I do, I'm so grateful for them.
Yeah. So what for you is the difference between, I guess, confusing God's power with his promises?
Yeah. So God can do anything. I mean, God could raise the dead. God could certainly have done any of those things that I was begging him to do. And so believing that God is able to do that, but yet he has different plans for us. And, there is not a molecule in the universe that is not under God's sovereignty. So there is nothing that God can't do, but yet we don't understand why things happen the way they do. I don't understand them. And yet I do believe that they all happen, that the works of God would be made manifest through them. And I will not know till heaven what all of that means, but I trust that God's presence is enough right now. And knowing that God has a purpose, even though I won't see it, is enough. So that I believe that he has the power, but he doesn't need to show it to me.
Yeah. You wrote an article a few years ago. What does it mean to be blessed? It's probably my favorite article that you've ever written. And I love the Porsche on the picture on the top. But the reason to bring that up is because you say the biggest gift God has given you is your suffering. Why is that the biggest gift God has given you? And is that what it means to be blessed?
Yeah. Well, it was interesting because I wrote that article, what does it mean to be #blessed? Because I kept noticing, and I'm not even on social media very much, but people even use that word all the time. Like, I'm so blessed to have, gotten this great job, or we're so blessed that, all this great stuff happened. And it was sort of this way to have a humble brag, like blessed was an easy way to say, got a scholarship. And so just really just started thinking, what does blessed mean in the Bible? And went through every reference in the New Testament. And I was sort of shocked that none of the references to being blessed had anything to do with great circumstances, but they had to do with drawing near to God, often in suffering. And that really has been my experience as well, is the more I have suffered, the closer I've gotten to God. And, Johnny Erickson Tata says, the deeper the pain, the closer the embrace. And I think that's really true. So I do think being #blessed or being blessed is anything that brings us closer to God. And suffering is probably the thing that in a lot of ways can bring us closest to God when we turn to him in it.
Yeah, you don't. I've actually never, I was thinking about this a while back, or talking to one of my buddies about it. You never really hear a story of a Christian that grew super close to God through a load of blessings. It just, even though they might be thankful for them, it just doesn't happen that they're like, I was so much closer to God when I got a yacht.
Yeah, exactly.
or something. Yeah.
I mean, nobody says my life was really bad. Then I got saved. God gave me all these things, and I was so much closer to him the more stuff I got. Like, you hear people say, had a hard life, but then those things drew me from God. Like, that's what people say. And that's what happened to me. Because I got this dream job when I was in Boston, went to Stanford for grad school, got everything I wanted. And that is actually when I drifted from God the most, was probably in my late 20s, was when I had everything I wanted. And it was really as God stripped things away that I got more of God and less of stuff.
Yeah. So I know a lot of people want God to help them through suffering, but they don't think they need God for salvation. And we know that we don't just need God for our daily needs to help through suffering, but more importantly, eternal life. So as you tell your story, because I'm sure you have to tell it many times, you're going on many podcasts, stuff like that, where does that fit in? Because I think that's really key, that for people to hear that, yes, God will bring you through the suffering, but more importantly, that's not the biggest issue. The biggest issue is that we've rejected his son, and we need to be reconciled to him.
Right. Our biggest problem in life isn't suffering or circumstances, it's sin. That's why Christ came. And it's interesting because you see when he heals the paralytic, the first thing, the friends drop him through the roof. And the first thing he says is, your sins are forgiven, because that's what we need. Like, that's the greatest gift. And then he looks around and is like, well, just so I can do this stuff, like get up and walk. But I think that's such a good picture of, like, your sins are forgiven is why we need Jesus. That is, we are eternally separated from God because of our sin. And that's why we have suffering anyway. I mean, that's all a result of the fall, but Christ came to make us right with God so we can be with him forever. And whatever happens in this life is over in the blink of an eye. And we have eternity. And that's why he came, is so that we can have eternity with God. And I mean, he came for lots of reasons. I mean, we can experience heaven on earth here because we have his presence, we have the Spirit, but ultimately it's all, what we have is heaven. And that was, I love Randy Alcorn says, happily ever after is a blood-bought promise for those of us in Christ.
Yes. Your best life later.
Yeah, exactly.
So you say it took 10,000 nights. This is from the book. It took 10,000 nights to learn the lessons of God's Spirit was teaching you in the pain, and you would not give up a moment if it meant that you had to unlearn those lessons. And that's often impossible to see when you are on day 500 or day 5,000 of a person suffering. And there's a lot of people suffering in this world. So I guess as we close this conversation, what would you say to the people listening that are on day 500 and day 5,000? I can't see the picture that you've now seen looking back of your life, where you've learned those lessons, but they might not know it, but they're learning the lessons.
Yeah. I would say to people who are sort of in the middle of it, one, be brave enough to lament. Like, call out to God. You don't need to do this on your own. You don't need to act like it's all okay. And one day things will, somehow turn around. Like, draw near to God right now and tell him exactly how you're feeling. Because for me, it is being really honest with God and vulnerable. We talked about being vulnerable with our friends, but just being vulnerable with God, like, this is hard and I want to walk away, but I don't. I want to be with you. So I would say, just keep talking to God. Don't ever stop. Ask him to draw near to you. Ask him for his presence. And I would say, open the Bible and ask God, please speak to me. I mean, I remember just saying, I kind of like Jacob, I'm not going to let you go until you bless me. I'm not leaving my quiet time until I hear from you. And God speaks. Somebody once said, God is always talking, but are we listening? And I think just asking God to attune our ears to hear his grace, to know that he really is in our minivan and he really is beside us when we're reading the word, so that even when our circumstances haven't changed, we have a different sense of what living through those means. Because I don't think you want to go through 5,000 days of slogging it out, just thinking, okay, one day there's heaven. I mean, certainly we want that. One day there's heaven, but in those 5,000 days, we want God to infuse them. Maybe our circumstances aren't better or changed, and maybe we live in agony, and maybe life is really hard. But we want to cry out to God to say, draw near to me, because that's how we make it through 10,000 nights.
And I guess on the flip side of that question, I know a lot of people that in many ways say they are super blessed and they're having a great life now and they're not suffering. And so I guess what would you tell yourself in your older 20s when everything was going well, like to the people that seem not to be suffering in this life, which I know is rare, but what would you say to those people, as most likely they will experience it one day? But yeah.
I would say to people who are not suffering, that feel like, life is great right now, I would say, enjoy what God has given you. I'm happy that God is honestly blessing you with those things, but don't put your value in those things and don't base your life on those things, because they might be here and they might be gone, but God will the word of God, and God himself will last forever.
Yeah. That's awesome. Well, thank you very much for doing this podcast. It means a lot. I very much appreciate the fact that you wrote the book and you keep writing, because I think it's been super helpful for a lot of people. My mom was telling me a while back how much she enjoys your writing. I think she'll be thrilled I got the chance to talk with you. So, and for everyone listening, Walking Through Fire, a memoir of loss and redemption. I think you can find it on Amazon, so you can put in the camera here. But yeah, it's a wonderful book. So thanks again. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on, Kyle.
Okay, thanks for listening, guys. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. I certainly did. If you enjoyed it, please, as always, share with friends and family, or all the stuff. Subscribe on YouTube. Comment on the podcast apps or on social media, wherever it is. It's really appreciated and helps the podcast get traction. Also, if you want to support the channel, the Patreon link is in the description below if you're watching this on YouTube. And I'll see you in the next one.